Good evening, everybody. Welcome once again to the AOI Certificate Series Basics to Advanced. We've had some wonderful sessions and a very good response. Today is the fifth lecture series in our series, and the focus today is on rhinology. Our speakers for today are Dr. Kranti Bhavna, who will be speaking on the clinical evaluation of nasal obstruction, smell and taste disorders, and Dr. Anthony, who will be talking on nasal septal disorders. Today, we are privileged to have two former presidents of the Association of Otolaryngologists of India as our moderators. So today we have Dr. Sudhakar Vaidya, who is the professor and head at the R.D. Gaddi Medical College at Ujjain. He has been very busy managing the COVID duties and arranging things. He has taken time off from his busy schedule to be here with us today. He is the editor-in-chief of the World Articles in Ear, Nose and Throat. The other moderator for the evening is also a former national president of the association in the year 2015. Dr. Viral Chhaya is the professor at the Pacific Institute of Medical Sciences at Jamnagar. He is also the Secretary General Asia Oceania Association of Otolaryngology and Head and Neck Surgery for the years 2019 till 2023. So I welcome them to the forum today, and I request Dr. Sudhakar Vaidya to please introduce our first speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. I welcome on behalf of AOI to the lecture series of AOI, lecture number 5. The speaker is Dr. Kranti Bhavna. She is additional professor and head of the Department of ENT at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Patna, and she will be speaking on clinical evaluation of nasal obstruction, smell and taste disorder. And her CV is very, very long. I will just brief. She is attached to the All India Institute, and she is a fellow of Royal Infirmary of Neurotology, Glasgow. She is a fellow of American Academy of Otolaryngology. She is a Baco Fellow. She is winner of various awards from AOI, Sandra Disa Award, Junior Consultant Award, Video Session Award, and E-Poster Award. She has also presented her video in American Academy Conference, which was selected for Master of Surgery section. And she has got various publications in international and national journals. I welcome him to this forum. And Dr. Kranti Bhavna now will be speaking on clinical evaluation of nasal obstruction, smell and taste disorder. The question answers will be put on the site, and we will be answering after the talk is over. Dr. Kranti Bhavna, please.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for this opportunity, and I would not have thanked less that this is one of the opportunity which you all have given me. And thank you, AOI body, especially Bhargav sir, Bharti ma'am, Dr. Kaushal Seth and Dr. Yogesh Dabulkar. And nothing would have been better to have two AOI past presidents moderating our session. Thank you, Sudhakar sir, for the introduction which you gave me. AOI has been something which has been, we have always grown up attending its conferences and have always dreamt about following stalwarts like you all. And thank you again for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that the topic which has been assigned to me, I would do justice to this. I've tried to make it according to a postgraduate level so that they can actually understand how basics of examination of nose is very, very important once you decide to go into not only rhinology. So I would like to share my screen now. Can I share my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So is my screen? Sir, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I would be talking about clinical evaluation of nasal obstruction, smell and taste disorders. And as I said before, this is an important topic because when you are trying to examine a patient of nasal obstruction, which is the most common symptom with which patients come to you with nasal pathology, it's important to have a stepwise evaluation to reach a proper diagnosis. So I would like to take you down. As I said, we will navigate this topic by briefly discussing anatomy and physiology of nasal obstruction. I'm sure that the anatomy and physiology has already been covered. We will be talking about the physiology and anatomy in perspective of nasal obstruction in brief. I will go ahead with clinical evaluation. We'll discuss a very interesting diagnostic algorithm as to how a patient should be actually assessed once they come to us, and then would be in brief discussing the etiology, and finally would come to smell and taste disorders and its evaluation. Brief mention also about the special scenario of loss of smell and taste in COVID times. So when we discuss the anatomy and physiology of nose, what actually nose does? Nose is evolutionarily adapted to warm, humidify and filter the inspired air before it reaches our lungs. And that is one of the most important function a nose does. The other being, it combats inhaled particles, and importantly, the odorant function of or the olfactory function nose is equally important because it is from that we get a sense of taste. It is because of olfaction that we get to detect dangerous smells. It is also evolved to bring in large volume of air through the nostrils and nasal cavities while also maximizing the air contact mucosal areas. This is a very important point when we talk about nasal patency and when we go about discussing nasal obstruction. So a large amount of air goes inside our nose, and nose from outside may appear small, but from inside the surface area is big because we know we have various anatomical structures and a large mucosal covering, which as I discussed physiology, I would like to tell you how it is important that it gives you a feeling of nasal breathing and nasal patency. So to have a normal physiology, what are the anatomical structures which are important for the nose? So you should have an increased nasal projection. Evolutionary humans have been given that. You should have an anterior nasal convexity. Exaggerated nasal angles. What do you mean by that? So there are certain angulations which are important, and it is so important for a rhinoplasty surgeon who plans his surgery according to these nasal angles, both when he's doing a functional rhinoplasty and when he's doing a cosmetic rhinoplasty. Then you have the anterior nasal spine prominence and the tip, which is so intricate with the combinations of various cartilages that form the nasal tip. And finally, one of the most important aspects of nose, which gives the concept of nasal obstruction, is the external and the internal nasal valve. So what nose does? It takes in the cool air, forms the air inside with the help of the mucosal covering, with the help of the turbinates and the area which warms and humidifies the air, and finally we get to breathe air which is suited for our pulmonary function. It is one of the very, very important aspects of nasal physiology. So for optimal nasal function, what are the four things which you actually require? Number one, you require a patent nasal passage. Number two, you require an intact mucociliary function and a normal receptors for airflow. Finally, your mucosa inside the nose should not be inflamed. These four important aspects give you optimal nasal function, and if either of these are not functioning properly, you will come up with the symptom of nasal obstruction. So what actually happens? Air flows through the nose. Turbinate induces a non-laminar flow. Respiratory a laminar, expiratory eddy currents are there. We know about the physiology of the nose. Why this is important in creating nasal obstruction, I'll just come up in brief. So air temperature is cooled inside, and finally the sensation of airflow and nasal patency is given to a person. But if any kind of dysfunction of mucociliary function happens or dysfunction of air passage happens, you will come up with nasal obstruction. So all this physiology, if it is disrupted at any particular pathway, will give you nasal obstruction. And when you clinically evaluate these people, it is important to know where in the physiology that obstruction has happened. So when we discuss that, we know that nose is not an isolated structure. Like any other organ, it has a skin and soft tissue structure outside. It has an intricate overlay of fine muscles. You have the nasal bones and the cartilages, and very important, the nasal septum. You also have the septal swell body, which is at the of around the at the end, starting of the middle turbinate, and people realize that this is an important structure to talk about nasal obstruction. And finally, you have the turbinates. Why I describe all these structures? Because you all know about the normal anatomy. But when we describe these structures, any of these structures, if it is normal, can lead to nasal obstruction. So when we clinically evaluate for nasal obstruction, we need to have a thorough knowledge of all these underlying structures which form the nose. So after what we know about the structure of nose, those two important aspects which I was telling you is the very, very important part when we discuss about nasal obstruction, and that is the external and the internasal valve area. Why this word valve? Because these are the areas where you actually have turbulence, you actually have obstruction. It is an area through which the airway actually makes the patient that it's going inside. So the external nasal valve is the valve which is right at the outside, bounded by the alar limb nasal cell. On the other hand, one of the most important part is the internal nasal valve area, where if you have any kind of obstruction, it is very, very symptomatic. It is not only guarded by the septum, but very important aspect is the upper lateral cartilage, lower border of the upper lateral cartilage and the inferior turbinate. That is why when you talk about nasal surgeries, the surgeries for turbinate, the surgeries for septum, the surgeries around the cartilages become important, because internal nasal valve area is the area which is sort of the narrowest, and it gives you, that is the area very, very important when we talk about nasal patency. As I said, and that's where the role of spreader graft comes. But okay, we will not go into the detail because I am here today to talk about clinical evaluation. But it's always important that you talk about pathology before you talk about evaluation. Nerve supply, blood supply, important, very, very important, because any abnormality into that also causes a feeling of nasal obstruction. So, three very important aspects of nasal patency. One is the nasal airflow resistance, as I talked already about laminar flow. You have the Bernoulli forces, which favors the collapse of nasal valve, and that is why the upper lateral cartilage, the lower lateral cartilage becomes important. The Poiseuille law, which says that any narrowing causes dramatic effect on the airflow. So these physiological dynamics are very, very important when you are evaluating for nasal function. We all are aware of the nasal cycle. It is actually a cyclic unilateral nasal congestion, asymmetry of blood flow and engorgement of erectile tissues. When you are awake, it ranges between 1.5 to 4 hours. This is natural for all of us. Many of us don't realize it, but there are certain sensitive individuals which they do realize it, and they will come to you with nasal obstruction. You have to explain them that this is normal nasal cycle and you should not be worried about it. Everything is normal inside, and they're certainly slightly more, you can say, sensitive towards feeling that nasal cycle. Finally, a very important aspect of anatomic innervation. We know that the nose is controlled by both sympathetic and parasympathetic supply. An imbalance between that becomes very, very important. If parasympathetic breaks, you will have a feeling of nasal obstruction because it controls the vascular tone, congestion, and secretions. Finally, the inflammatory pathway of nose, the inferior turbinate hypertrophy, sinonasal inflammation, they're all hallmark of nasal obstruction. I am not going into details because these in itself are very long topics. They are pathological topics and they would be addressed separately. So before I come into clinical evaluation, I should know that what actually causes nasal obstruction. It can be both anatomic, that is, you have changes in the internal structure permanently, physiologic problems, and then you have the pathophysiologic problems. The anatomical problems can range from septal deviation, atrophies of turbinate, puncta bullosa, and other abnormalities of the middle turbinates, etc. You can have lateral nasal wall abnormality, and as usual, the posterior corner can have adenoid. These are all normal anatomic variations. On the other hand, when you talk about physiologic variation, as I said, nasal cycle, certain individuals will have sensitivity towards nasal cycle and come to you with nasal obstruction. Pregnancy with hormonal changes definitely is a physiologic condition, but causes importantly in many patients nasal obstruction issues. When we talk about pathophysiology, it can range from inflammatory to vasomotor neurogenic, congenital, iatrogenic, neoplasm, and metabolic. Why you want to know about that? Because as you evaluate the patient, you want to categorize as to in which section these patients can be put into. And that's where you have to start with the first thing which we have been taught in our MBBS is a detailed history. It is not possible to reach a good diagnosis in nasal pathology if you do take a detailed history. It's not only about poking the endoscope inside the nose and seeing inside. No. Take a proper corroborative history. Start with location, whether the obstruction is unilateral, bilateral. If it's unilateral, which side it is. If it is bilateral, which side is worse. And does obstruction fluctuate? All these points are important when you go for the pathology. Unilateral and pediatric, you have nasal foreign body, etc. When you come to severity, you have to ask the patient categorically whether it's mild obstruction, moderate, or very severe, whether it's impacting his daily life, how does the severity fluctuate, and if you are meticulous enough, you could take the nose score, which the patients can fill on a form. You can get it translated in your local language, and you can have excellent subjective evaluation. Timing is very important. How long it has been present, or it just came up now after sudden trauma, and if it is constant or if there are periods of worsening, and does it recur? Then in history, you also have to ask about the setting. Where is the specific location of obstruction? Have they started on any new medication? Have they had URTI history? Are they pregnant? Any exposure to chemicals? These are important things when you are asking about nasal obstruction history. What about the aggravating factors? What about the relieving factors? Typical questions, but when you look at the nose, there are certain leading questions. So whether this nasal obstruction is good inside or outside, do cigarettes or drinking alcohol worsens it? You are eating certain kind of food, you are going in dust, mold, you know how, allergic, etc., causes aggravation. In a particular work environment, if it is aggravating. Why these are important? Because that's where it shows so many nasal pathology might not require any surgical correction. It's about these factors important when you're counseling the patient and telling that, A simple thing as changing the work environment can help them. What are the relieving factors? Sometimes a simple Cottle test relieves. So you know, okay, yes, there is some kind of anatomic obstacle. And very, very important, after you have asked all those things, you also have to ask what are the associated factors, whether allergic factors are associated with it, like pruritus, whether infectious factors are associated with it, like fever, pain, pressure, purulent discharge, sinusitis, etc. And finally, if it is associated with postnasal discharge, snoring, olfactory or taste dysfunction, and then very importantly, epistaxis. I've placed epistaxis at the last, but you know that many patients of nasal obstruction come up with epistaxis. According to age, you can have different diagnosis of the same. So this is one diagnostic algorithm I wanted to discuss in detail. It has been taken from the clinics of North America, but I think it is very, very pertinent for a postgraduate point of view when you are taking the history. So you have a patient coming with nasal obstruction. You ask whether unilateral, bilateral, take a good history, then come to the setting. If it was acute, suspect iatrogenic or nasal bone fracture, hematoma, abscess. Was persistent, suspect a static obstruction like septal deviation or turbinate hypertrophy. Ask for aggravating factors. So whether deep nasal exercise or deep nasal breathing aggravates it. Then you can have, what you can have is anatomic obstruction of nasal valve collapse. In relieving factor, which is relieved by modified Cottle's maneuver, then all these things tell you that there is some anatomic problem and it might require surgical management plus minus medical management. On the other hand, if you have association in terms of pruritus, sneezing, nausea, fever, etc., then you can have acute sinusitis, chronic sinusitis, allergic rhinitis, etc., and would require more of medical management than surgical. So, by that, you are actually categorically defining in your head as to which kind of management this patient requires. Right from the history, before going to any, rhinoscopy, you can actually come in your mind that which kind of pathology you would be dealing. So when you come to the physical exam of nasal obstruction, you have the external nasal examination, the proper head and neck examination, the rhinoscopy, maneuvers, and finally endoscopy. So do not, as I say, never ignore the external examination. With many instruments coming up, people would just, patient comes with nasal obstruction, they don't even bother to see outside, they will just put in their nasal endoscope. That's a wrong thing to do. Look at the patient in totality. Look at his whole head and neck. Look at his orbits. Look at his cheek. Look at the loss of grooves. Look at these lines on the nasal dorsum, which could be a harbinger sign for allergic rhinitis, where you can, so-called allergic salute. These are the old age defined examination concepts that you should never lose. By examining the exterior aspect, you are also seeing for the deviations. You are not only seeing for the septal deviation, you are also seeing from deviation from outside. As you say, the whole bony framework, it has to be very, very categorically examined, and then you do the tip elevation test, by which you can examine the vestibule in detail. Coming to the next examination for the anterior rhinoscopy, you can see the septum, inferior turbinate, middle turbinate. You can evaluate the mucosal abnormality. You can see for overall nasal dimensions, contact between surfaces and synechias. You can obviously see the occluded nasal passages, polyps of Augie mucosa, for purulent nasal discharge. You can use the Tudicums, you can use the Killian, use your otoscope. But at undergraduate level, we know we have all been taught how to use the Tudicum. This was a very pet questions of our examiner. So that is what for anterior rhinoscopy. A brief mention of something which I don't do routinely. We know it's posterior rhinoscopy, but you all should know about it. The St. Clair Thompson post-nasal mirror. I know this is under section, but I think you should know how it is done. If it is available at your place, you can see the posterior corner in detail. But what nowadays is important is the nasal endoscopy. All of you should, as postgraduates, as senior residents, should have a 0-degree endoscope. to see pathologies like that, in which you can see the whole of the structure, the first pass, second pass, and the third pass. But you can see something which is very, very, you can see the pathology so clearly. Putting your scope inside once, nothing can give you a clearer picture than a nasal endoscope. A simple 0-degree nasal endoscope should be a part and parcel of your nasal examination in today's time. There is no excuse now as to just go ahead with evaluating only doing anterior rhinoscopy. Why I say that? Because times have changed, our management has changed. Excuse me. And this is again a small video just to show that something like this is not a cause of nasal obstruction, obviously, but something like this, it's a small meningocele. This is not possible by just going for anterior rhinoscopy. So what is here to emphasize is nasal endoscopy should be a part and parcel of nasal obstruction evaluation or evaluation of any nasal pathology. That's why I just wanted to show you these two. Importantly, nasal is best visualized by nasal endoscopy, as I said, especially the posterior nasal structures. Nothing can give you a clearer view of the adenoids, about the trachea tube area, about your sinuses, your sphenoid sinuses, about your turbinates, about the pathology inside that, conal atrachas, etc. So anatomy, pathology, both of it can be categorically seen using a nasal endoscopic examination. When you go for the other evaluation of nasal obstruction, we talk about Cottle's and modified Cottle. Cottle is something which can be done by the patient himself. You can diagnose it yourself. Just you pull the cheek laterally, and if your obstruction is relieved, you can understand there is some kind of nasal valve collapse or a deviation which is giving you a problem. But then came the modified Cottle's maneuver. It is extensively used by all pathologists. You can use a small Jobson horn probe, put some cotton on top of it, and put your probe at the external nasal valve area and the internal nasal valve area and evaluate whether your nasal function improves or not. So many gradients have been done for that, and clinicians do take up this test routinely when they are going for a functional surgeries for nasal valve collapse. Nasal obstruction clinical evaluation cannot be complete without sinus imaging. Sinus imaging is a big topic. Various sections of sinus imaging. I'll not go into the details, but just I want to tell you that you have to go for sinus imaging, and in today's time, nothing replaces a CT scan. You start, if you have you have taken a good history, you start with non-contrast CT scan, but always advise your radiologist to have all the three cuts. Coronal and sagittal. If you have corroborative history of some kind of epistaxis and you are expecting nasal obstruction, you should also go for a contrast enhanced CT scan. Nothing can undermine the importance of MRI nowadays. So believe me, I just had a talk yesterday, and Dr. Sanjay Vaid was speaking about the role of MRI. So you are having a suspicion of neoplasm, suspicion of unilateral nasal obstruction. You combine both of it. Do both CT scan and MRI. It helps immensely in your diagnosis and your decision making. And finally, other allied aspects like DSAs, etc. when you go for pathology. So just a small view of how CT can be helpful in conal atracha, concha bullosas, paradoxical middle turbinate, angiofibromas, encephaloceles. As I told you, today is not the time to discuss all that because this is some other topic. Imaging is in itself a very topic, but want to tell you that this is a part and parcel of nasal obstruction evaluation. Then we come up to other tests. So you have the allergy testing, you have the acoustic rhinomanometry, peak nasal airflow, mucosal biopsy for neoplasms, etc. So for anatomic measures, you go for acoustic rhinomanometry imaging studies and clinician-derived examination finding. For physiologic measures, you can use rhinomanometry, nasal peak inspiratory flow, and computational fluid dynamics. You have the PROMs, like the patient-reported outcome measures. So when you are talking of nasal obstruction, this is something very, very subjective. So if you have these kind of forms, or the nose scores, or the snot 20, as you call upon, various kind of such subjective measures are available, which helps immensely in, as I said, decision-making of management of nasal obstruction. You have the clinician-derived outcomes, you have various gradings like the lateral insufficiency grade. These are important for rhinoplasty surgeons, but they have graded the collapse as 0, 1, 2, 3 in various levels, which I'm not an expert on rhinoplasty, to be very frank, but what I want to tell you is these are certain outcome measures which have been derived, especially in rhinoplasty field, to make a good decision making for management of the same. You talk about acoustic rhinomanometry, very well said by, again, rhinoplastic surgeons, at that this is as important as audiology for an otologist. So acoustic rhinomanometry, people who are doing septorhinoplasties, who are doing functional and cosmetic surgeries, rhinomanometry is something which they should have. It actually calculates the cross-sectional area of nasal cavity. It is fast. You can even do it in children. The disadvantage is that static measurement of dimension will only obtained. It is not dynamic. And you have to do pre and post congestion. So acoustic rhinomanometry is something which is a big armamentarium for deciding the pre and post surgical outcomes as well. So it is an important thing when we discuss about obstruction. So PNIF is something, we had a small study about it, but it measures the maximum airflow a patient is able to produce following 4 nasal inspiration, and it measures nasal patency. This is a very nice instrument which can be used just in OPD setting also to see pre and post-op or pre-examination of peak nasal inspiratory flow. There's something which is recent. Computational fluid dynamics, the computational model of patient's airway, generated a combination of CT or MRI, computes both nasal airflow, nasal resistance, also gives you idea of heat transfer and humidification, and can detect actually exact site of obstruction. I have not seen it. This is something which I got from recent cases, but people are going for these 3D dynamics only for airflow, but also from outside structures. As I was talking about the nose score, a very nice categorization where patient can themselves circle the correct response and scoring is made about nasal congestion, stuffiness, blockage or obstruction, whether you have trouble breathing through your nose, trouble sleeping, unable to get enough air through nose during exercise or exertion, and you calculate these nose scores and finally you get whether the patient is having mild to moderate or severe nasal obstruction. So in functional rhinoplasty, you have the nose scales, obstruction, septoplastic effectiveness scales. For aesthetic, you have other kind of scales, because then you are talking about benefit inventories. When you talk about combined functional and aesthetic rhinoplasty, then you have other kind of scales like rhinoplasty outcome evaluations. So functional rhinoplasty is basically done for obstruction, and that's why these scales are important. So in brief, that's what I wanted to tell you about clinical evaluation of nasal obstruction. And now just to go for the second section of diagnosis and evaluation of smell and taste disorders. So how do we smell by nose? This is again a normal physiologic process. You have the olfactory mucosa, you have the olfactory sensory epithelium way back at the top of your nose. You have various cells, the supporting cells, the sustentacular cells, the mitral cells, which then projects through your olfactory nerve to the and to the higher centers where limbic system becomes important, where response to smell becomes important. So the olfactory pathway is a complicated pathway, and that's why the test for olfaction, the symptoms of olfaction are a very subtle sense organ issues which has to be evaluated in in a slightly detailed manner, because when you talk about subjective problems of smell, it's very difficult for people to realize suddenly that they have issues with smell. Many questionnaires, many studies have shown that subjective evaluation of smell is something which is very difficult. The taste pathway, we know both 7th and 9th, 10th, all are involved, and it finally goes through the thalamus, gustatory cortex. Just a brief mention of both physiology, because taste and smell are very, very closely related. If you lose the sense of smell, you lose the sense of flavor. So, because the tests also, when you're talking about, they are very much overlapping. So olfaction plays role in detection of aroma and flavor of foods. Its disruption can cause a lot of depression because they cannot enjoy food, they stop drinking, eating, and unfortunately, they are unable to detect bad odor, smoke, bad food, leaking gas, etc. And for certain occupations, it is devastating. For chefs, for perfumers, for firefighters, etc. Olfaction is also a very, very important function of nose, and we just cannot ignore it. In COVID times, it has become a key symptom of COVID-19. Evaluation is not just ENT. It starts from a primary care physician, and then the ENT comes into picture. You will have to take help of neurologists, allergists, oral consultants, because all these aspects are important in the pathophysiology of smell disorders. So I'll be talking basically about examination of smell and taste. So sudden loss of smell usually is because of viral or respiratory illness. It can happen after head injury and recently 19. Gradual loss of smell can happen because of allergic rhinitis. This is conductive smell. You can have, then you can have asthma doing the same, and then you can have in the brain. It's a LFL for a gradual loss of smell. Should always evaluate in detail. And toxic fumes also slowly lead to gradual loss of smell. Since taste is closely associated with smell, loss of smell leads to loss of flavor. Fungal infection, glossitis, etc. are important etiologies behind it. Total loss is very rare. It could be some anatomic loss of nerve, etc. that the taste is completely lost. So a step ladder pattern, patient comes with a problem, goes to a primary care physician, ENT, allergist, oral consultants, they all have to be involved together to reach to a diagnosis of smell and taste disorder. So there are some office-based tests. We have all heard about the UPSIT, University of Pennsylvania Smell Identification Test. So you have the 40 encapsulated odorants that are released by rubbing of a pencil, and the patient can recognize that. And the other one is the sniff and stick, or the threshold discrimination identification test, EDIT. Small sticks are available, and then it is very fast. It takes around 4 minutes according to one of the studies. And it can be derived from University of Dresden Medical School, Germany. So these are office-based tests. You can ask the patient to sit and do that in your OPD itself. But as I told, smell disorders are not so simple. Might require certain very complicated sensory testing to look for exact cause and also for exact problem faced by the patient. So there are certain very specific tests. You have the butanol threshold test, whole taste test, partial flavor discrimination test, and the somatosensory test, which can be later, once you have come to a diagnosis, you will go for imaging and lab studies. So the butanol threshold test, it is a sweet kind of odor. Each bottle contains either water or odorant, and each nostril can be tested separately. you can also test the threshold between point of detection and no detection and try to be tested. On the other hand, you have the whole mouth taste test. You detect, identify, rate various concentration of sweet, sour, bitter taste solution in the whole of the mouth. And then you have the specific spatial test. So you have these small cotton swab dipped into different taste solutions and put into the various areas of the tongue, where you can actually say which area is tasting what. And you have the flavor discrimination. So flavor accounts for both smell and taste. And you have not only different taste, but different levels of that, so that you can have both the smell and taste running together to give you that kind of discrimination. So specific centers are there now for these chemosensory testing. And finally, you have the somatosensory testing. I just came up with, just read about this Siemens-Winston monofilaments. It exerts a force when applied to a peripheral nerve field proportional to the gauge of the monofilament. So this is something which is which perhaps gives you a lot of detail. I just read about it, don't know a lot of detail about it, but just to mention, I think we should be aware of these recent tests which are taking place in this. So just to end my talk, a brief mention about what is happening in COVID-19. We are badly affected. Our country is badly affected. Where I sit today at AIIMS, we are badly affected. So in some patients, anosmia is the first symptoms of COVID-19. A sudden loss of smell in areas with high infection rate in COVID. Hence, it has become a key diagnostic symptom, both loss of taste and loss of smell. A few early studies showed that it could be, in 30 to 98% of patients in hospitals were having loss of smell. So it particularly attacks the sense of smell, and since both taste and smell are closely related, it becomes the key symptom. Till now, papers are coming up, many research are happening, trials are happening that why this happened. And I was just scrolling through and looking through certain recent literature, and I came up with certain interesting aspects about decoding the puzzle. So there's this global chemosensory research consortium which was made by Penn State. 30,000 responses were taken, and they came up with certain interesting findings. So they saw that what is actually happening. So they have not yet published it. So something which is under consideration and research level. But I just thought that let me just mention it. So the sustentacular cells allow greatest entry to SARS-CoV-2 virus. The microvillar and stem cells and the Bowman's gland of the olfactory epithelium also gives easy access to this virus. And finally, what happens is causes dysfunction or death of the olfactory sensory neurons. So what is happening is at the peripheral level. If you can look at this diagram, the area where it is reddish is that small area where this virus is playing havoc. So it's usually not causing a central nervous system problem, because it is also reverting back. So, this is the small area which is causing problem. And at times, patients are also having mucosal inflammation. So that is also one reason why patients can have smell issues. And there are two receptors that they have mentioned, the ACE2 and TMPRSS2. Both of it, the SARS virus targets. And SARS needs both of it. And it binds with some spike protein, it gains entry into the olfactory sensory epithelium and causes peripheral loss. This is just a research thing which is just coming up at the genetic molecular level. I hope the papers will come out soon as to why this virus actually just attacks the olfactory soon. So this is the American Academy. They came back way back in, I think, this I downloaded in March. And this is what they came up immediately after patients started reporting anosmia. And they came up with anosmia reporting tools for clinicians. And they have to report this, and that's how they're collecting information about anosmia. And now they have placed it into a key symptoms for COVID-19. So these neurons take lifelong, so it may take up to 30 days or more for return of the function. And it might, I don't know, many months have not gone by, but it could be permanent. Who knows what is happening with COVID? There are so many things which are unexplained. But yes, people are coming with the concept of smell retraining therapy, which is a treatment for anosmia. That this will also help in patients of COVID. So this is what I wanted to tell about COVID and smell disorders. So I hope I was well in time, around 40 minutes. And just to end, it's important that before we go to advanced levels of rhinology, advanced level of ENT surgeries, we need to climb the ladder from basic to advanced. You have to fit in these puzzles to really come up to a proper diagnosis before you intervene. So thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk on this forum, and I hope I was clear. I don't know whether I have missed few points, but just to give you an overview, this is what the talk was all about for today. Thank you again, AOI body, for giving me this chance to talk this topic. Thank you.
It was an excellent talk. There are some questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
The question is coming from Meena Kale, Mumbai. What is nose score? NOSE score.
So I'll just share the screen again, and I hope my screen is there. So this is a score out of 100, and I'll just show you what are the aspects in it. This is a score which is very taken by rhinoplasty surgeons. So if you can see this, it is for nasal obstruction, and it is given to the patient. For last 1 month, they are asked about the problems. So it is at the category of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whether the patient is having a problem, mild problem, moderate or fairly bad problem, or severe. And the various 5 important aspects are nasal congestion or stuffiness, nasal blockage or obstruction, trouble breathing through my nose, trouble sleeping, and unable to get enough air through my nose during exercise or exertion. So you actually categorize this, and out of 100, you see exact scores. I might not be able to tell you now as to how much they say mild, moderate, severe, but this is how these 5 scores are charted through these 4 grades.
Okay. So there is another question from Dr. Sapna from Kozhikode. She's asking, there are many patients coming with anosmia after RTS, some head injury. So how you manage, and even if there may be some time even the CT and endoscopy is normal. So what could be the cause?
A very difficult question, sir. Road traffic, head injuries causing anosmia are very poor prognosis. Like for other pathophysiology, if it is allergic, you can actually try glucocorticoid, etc. For head injury patients, whether it's shearing or what has happened to olfactory sensory epithelium, or it is central cause, it's very difficult to decide. So head injury patients have poor prognosis in comparison to other pathophysiology, but you can try some kind of glucocorticoid, you can try steroid therapy or smell retraining therapy. But as I said, the prognosis is not good in head injury patients.
Our Dr. Kaushal Seth is asking, are these office-based tests, especially the sniffing test strips, are available in India?
What I got from literature is you can order it from Germany. I don't think I'm not sure whether it's available or not, sir.
There is another question from Bilwara, Dr. Rajesh Jain. What is SNOT? S-N-O-T, SNOT.
So SNOT scores are SNOT 22. You can have 22 different questions of SNOT scores, and as far as I remember, these are very good scores for sinonasal outcome measures. So it's sinonasal outcome test. You have 22 different predictors, and it's almost like nose score, but the questions are in detail. So it is a predictor of pre and post surgical outcomes actually. and it is a very subjective score which the patient fills.
Okay. Another question from Rajesh Jain. Treatment of internal nasal valve obstruction.
So this is a this is a long topic. Internal nasal valve obstruction can happen. It's a topic in itself. Nasal valve obstruction can happen due to many different causes. As I was telling about, it can happen because of the cartilages which forms the upper roof of it. It can happen because of the septal deviation. It can happen because of the turbinate problem. It can happen because the upper lateral cartilage is thin enough. So this is you can have the nasal angle problem where the role of spreader graft comes. So if you have a septal anomaly, as I said, the internal nasal valve area in itself is formed by the septum, the lower border of upper cartilage, and the infraturbinate. So any of these three issues, if it is causing problem, you can have the internal nasal valve problem. So sometimes the septoplasty might correct it. Sometimes you require both septorhinoplasty. Sometimes you require just a turbinate addressing. So that's how you can actually. And then if you have obviously a pathology like neoplasm obstructing that area, you need to clear that. So that's how internal nasal valve. And as I told it's a separate topic in itself when you talk about the cartilage resilience, when you talk about the septum, when you talk about the turbinates.
Yeah. So another question from Dr. Dipankar Mukherjee from Kolkata. He is asking what is smell retraining therapy? There is a tinnitus retraining therapy, something like that. Smell retraining therapy.
Yeah. So smell retraining therapy, I did not go a lot in detail of smell retraining therapy, but it starts with, so what these people do, there are two ways to do it. As you diagnose these patients, there are so many home remedies, but smell retaining therapy actually happens in proper chemosensory places where they are given different concentration of different odorants. Slowly they are asked to train with those different concentration of odorants. You can go through smell retraining therapy. There are available websites for it. But frankly, I have not gone through smell retraining therapy for my patients. In India, I don't know who is doing it, but as I said, different concentrations of particular odorants are given to the patient to smell, and with time they are habituated to that kind of odorant, and then they are given different odorants, and it takes time. It takes a fairly long time to come back, and it's something which is in the trial method actually. So it is almost like tinnitus retraining therapy, that you train it with different concentrations of odorants.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Kranti Bhavna. You had a very good talk on a detailed and a good explanation of the nasal obstruction, the smell and taste diseases and their clinical evaluation. It was really a contemporary topic at present in the COVID scenario when there are a lot of patients. They are coming for smell, anosmia or hyposmia. Maybe I am suffering from COVID. So it's a good revision also for the seniors and for the juniors. It may be a really eye-opener. So I thank you a lot on behalf of Association of Otolaryngologists of India and from my side. Thank you very much. Over to the main office.
Thank you, Dr. Kranti, for that excellent talk. Now, we have the second speaker, and may I request Dr. Viral Chhaya to introduce Dr. Anthony. Dr. Viral, can you unmute yourself? Dr. Viral is there? Yeah, I think he's joined. Mehul, is Dr. Viral there or lost contact? Our next speaker for the evening is Dr. Anthony, and we all know Dr. Anthony Francis as an excellent teacher. He's the professor of ENT at the Madras Medical College, Chennai. He has more than 25 years of experience. Yeah, Mehul, is Dr. Viral there? His key achievements have been more than 3,000 endoscopic ear surgeries, including stepidotomies, cholesteatoma surgery. He has been invited for several talks, including the first World Congress of Endoscopic Ear Surgery Conference at Dubai 2015. He is also a keen rhinologist and has expertise in endoscopic sinus surgeries and skull-based surgeries. So may I request Dr. Anthony Francis to come forward with his presentation on septal disorders and
Am I audible?
Anthony, a little louder, please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. First of all, I thank the AOI body for giving me this opportunity. Can I share my slides?
Yes, please.
Yes, when you had ego. Mara.
Hello. Yes. Thank you everyone. I thank our moderators and our AOE body for giving me this opportunity. And I should profusely thank Gandhi Bhavana madam for taking up all the topics, what is prerequisite and what is relevant for my talk. So thank you very much, madam. And I am going to talk everything about what everybody knows. It's only for the postgraduates, because the standard questions what they ask in the exam in the postgraduate throughout India are almost the same. So we should know what is standard, because all the recent things, you go every conference, everybody talks about the recent advances, but it is very rare to see what is classically being taught. And as you know, the septal surgeries or these SMRs and the septoplasties are all taught in the UG itself, and so you are not afforded to make mistakes in these topics. So I am Dr. Anthony. I am a professor in Madras Medical College, and this is my alma mater, where I did my MBBS, DLO, MS, and I was an assistant professor, and now I am a professor here. So, to introduce, the nasal obstruction is the commonest presenting symptom for people who come to the otorhinological as well as the primary physician's clinic. As you know, 30% of the practice is for the nasal obstruction, and the people who suffer, it causes a lot of emotional, financial, and the work pressure because of this nasal obstruction. As you know, the common functions of the nose are the airway. It takes the air from the nose to your lungs. It works as a unified airway, and it gives you the resistance. This resistance is very, very important to know how much amount of air goes inside, so that whether it is sufficient amount of air is going or not, we'll have an idea. Then its nose is important for protection of a lower respiratory tract by taking away the foreign body, having this mucociliary action which will catch all the foreign bodies, as well as it causes protective reflexes. And olfaction, which we already told, it gives a resonance to your voice, and humidification, temperature regulation, and the mucociliary clearance. So the nasal septum is got two functions. It's a functional as well as cosmetic. It divides the nose into two cavities. Actually, a single nose like a mouth will have more space for air to go inside, but that's not true, because the functional unit of the nasal cavity is the nasal mucosa. You need more mucosa to have a more function. So to do that, the lateral wall of the nose have got the convolution, which is called the turbinates, which can swell up. At the same time, the amount of mucosa is increased by having a septum which has got a mucosa on both sides. Because of this, the the nasal septum has done the helps in the functional as well as the cosmetic, because it gives the support for the dorsum of the nose. If you are middling with the nasal septum inadvertently, not a proper way, it will cause the collapse of the projection of the nose, and it gives the shape to the columella and the tip of the nose, and it regulates the hair flow. The problem in flow of the air is almost caused as that of the nasal obstruction. So before we go into the topic per se, I like to show you a video. You can see this is the correct plane of doing the septal surgery. Whatever surgery you do, you go into the correct plane, the amount of bleeding will be very, very less. When the bleeding is lesser, you can do a good work. So when you do a septal surgery, you separate the nasal septum, the septum proper, and from the mucociliary unit. So once you separate the mucoperichondrium and the mucoperiosteum, so what is below is the bone, and that's a mucoperiosteal flap, and what is above is the mucoperichondrial flap, and connect both these two, you elevate a flap. Right? So we elevate 4 flaps in the case of a submucosal resection, and you elevate 3 flaps in the case of a septoplasty. So you make an incision on the cartilage and elevate the same way on the opposite side. So this makes 4 flaps. Then we use what is called as Ballinger's file knife and take out the septum and remove the problematic bone, so that the septum gets corrected. I am not going into the anatomical detail of which has been already taught to you by your previous speaker. So I go straight to the the nasal septum. When you go to the nasal septum, the important thing is you have certain understanding. So this is called the superior and this is called the inferior. But when you take like this is the caudal end and this is the cephalic end. So when you do anything on this area, it's called cephalic, and what is done here is called a caudal. And similarly, the projected part is an anterior, and the close to the floor is called the posterior. Right? So when you talk about the medial wall of the nose, which is nothing but a septum, it's got 3 parts. One is the columnar part, which is in the front, which is formed by the medial crest of the alar cartilage, and then in between the columella and the septum proper, you have 2 layers of only skin, which is called a membranous septum. And when you go to the third part is the septum proper. This consists of an osteocartilaginous framework. It consists of 3 major parts and 5 minor parts. The major parts are all perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, vomer. These are all the bony parts, and the septal cartilage. The minor elements are crest of the nasal bone, nasal spine of frontal bone, then you have a rostrum of sphenoid, crest of the palatine bone, crest of the maxilla, and then anterior nasal spine of the maxilla. So when you see the nasal septum, this is your cartilaginous part, this is the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, this is the vomer, and you have a maxillary crest, you have a palatine crest, and here you have a rostrum of sphenoid. Here you have a nasal bone as well as the frontal crest of the nasal bone of nasal spine of the frontal bone, and you have a maxillary crest. And you got to know a little bit about the lateral wall also. The lateral wall of the nose is formed by 7 bones: ethmoid, maxilla, palatine bone, lacrimal bone, pterygoid plate of the of sphenoid, and then inferior terminate, which is by itself is a separate bone. The lateral wall has got a superior terminate, middle terminate, and an inferior terminate, which will give you the resistance and forms the part of a nasal obstruction. I don't want to go into the details. We go straight into the nasal septal deviation. The nasal septal deviation can be a C-shaped deviation or an S-shaped deviation. A C-shaped deviation is the one which curves to one side, and S-shaped deviation is the one which curves on both sides. And then it can be superior-inferior, or it can be antero-posterior. So similarly, a C-shaped deviation can come from anterior to posterior, or an S-shaped deviation can come from anterior to posterior, go on both sides. And then when you go into the etiology of the nasal septal deviation, the commonest cause is developmental. When you have a birth molding theory, when the baby comes out, particularly in a normal delivery, there will be a certain amount of tension occurred over the nasal septum, which cause the septum to twist and turn, which will produce septal deviation. Another cause is the trauma. Whenever you have a nasal bone fracture, there will be a fracture of the nasal septum, which will lead you to hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
And then it can be because of secondary to any tumor or anything which pushes the septum to the opposite side. The trauma may be when you can know whether the patient has got a trauma, or sometimes you may not know whether the patient has got trauma or not. So it can happen in a childhood when the parent doesn't notice the trauma, which will cause disparity in the growth of the nasal septum, can lead on to a nasal septal deviation. So a nasal septal deviation can produce following things. One is the nasal airway obstruction. Airway goes inside and got two types of nasal current, which is called a linear one and a turbulent one. The linear one goes in the middle, and the turbulent one gives you the feel of the air going inside and gives you the purification function. Whenever the air goes inside, it touches upon the turbinates, it forms an eddy current, and off the current will go inside, and off the air will go for a second round. So keep touching on the lateral wall of the nose, where there is a mucosa, will take away all the suspended particles, and which will be transmitted to your nasopharynx. So one of the important function is this nasal airflow. Whenever there's a septal deviation, it will get obstructed. It will increase the nasal resistance. Because of this increased nasal resistance, patient will have a nasal obstruction. Whenever there is a sharp deviation and the bony deviation or a spur in the nasal septum, the patient will have a excessive drying and crusting. So, as you know, the blood vessels are going just under the mucous membrane in the nasal cavity, and the blood supply of the nose is very high, which gets the blood supply from both the internal caroidal artery and an external caroidal artery. The blood vessels will be very high, and trivial injury produces a lot of bleeding. So whenever the crust dislodges because of a blowing of the nose or nose picking or by itself, it will produce epistaxis. The third one is called a facial pain. Whenever the nasal spur is touching on the lateral wall of the nose, whenever the mucosa swells, normally as in a nasal cycle, or is because of some infection or inflammation, the mucosa will be pressed by the spur, which will produce release of the local cytokinins, which will cause the sensation of pain. And then the second one is the high deviation will press upon the anterior ethmoidal nerve, which is called Sludder's neuralgia or anterior ethmoidal nerve syndrome. This can be diagnosed by packing the nose with a 4% xylocaine. If you pack the nose with a 4% xylocaine and the pain immediately disappears, that is a Sludder's neuralgia or an anterior ethmoidal nerve syndrome. Sometimes it can happen in a patient who has got a frontal sinusitis also. The next one is the sinusitis. The deviated nasal septum can compress an osteometal complex, makes the space between the two mucosal surfaces lesser, and which will cause increased incidence of mucosal contact zones can produce sinusitis. The obstructive sleep apnea syndrome can be produced by the dynamic obstruction, or it can be produced by the static obstruction also. We call that the box and the content theory. The box is nothing but the nasal septum and the lateral wall. Whenever there's a gross deviation on one side or an S-shaped deviation, that can sometimes contribute to the obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. And this can be obstruct the view of certain things, like if there's an epistaxis. Where if you have a gross septal deviation and there's a bleeding beyond that septal deviation, it is even very difficult for us to pack the nose. That might require us to do a emergency septal correction. But commonly, it can affect a polyp, it can affect a malignancy, it can affect any other pathology. So, when you got to correct the nasal septum, before you examine the nose completely, particularly when you have a grossly deviated nasal septum, then it can be corrected for a access in a case of a functional endoscopic sinus surgery, orbital surgeries like DCR or orbital decompression, or endoscopic skull-based surgery. And if you want to visualize an osteometal complex, then you got to do a septal correction. So these are all the effects of deviated nasal septum, which needs to be corrected to take care of all these things. The septal deviation can be a caudal deviation or an anterior septal
Dr. Anthony,
deviation.
may I interrupt? Dr. Anthony, can you speak a little louder and a little slower?
Okay, right.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, the C-shaped deviation is the one which is shown here, and this is an S-shaped deviation. A sharp deviation of the bone is called as septal spur. Sharp angulation or sharp deviation of a bone, only one area, is called a septal spur. And there is a gross thickening, particularly at the level of the middle of the nasal septum, occurs on both sides. It's called septal turbinate or septal thickening or swell bodies. There is a classification for a septal deviation. It's called Mladina classification. This is the Mladina classification, where type 1 is the deviated nasal septum, which will not interfere with the nasal valve. Type 2 is the deviated nasal septum, which will interfere with the nasal valve, produces nasal obstruction, which can be corrected by the Cort's maneuver. Grade 3 is the eye septal deviation, which obstructs the osteometal complex, producing sinusitis, or it can obstruct the view of a middle turbinate, so that doing an endoscopic sinus surgery will be difficult. Type 4 is the one where there is a two crust on both sides. Type 5 is the sharp crust on only one side. This is what we call as a spur. And type 6 is the one you have a deviated on one side and the spur on the opposite side. And any combination of any one of this will be known as a type 7. This classification is called Mladina classification. Okay. So when you want to evaluate the patient with the deviated nasal septum, which will commonly produces nasal obstruction. So the deviated nasal septum the nasal obstruction or airway resistance, increased airway resistance, can be due to structural causes, physiological causes, or a pathological causes. You remember physiological causes like pregnancy and nasal cycle. So structural causes and pathological causes are always already dealt very well with our previous speaker. So we got to examine the patient clinically. Clinical examination, then you do for anatomical causes, you do a clinical examination, acoustic rhinomanometry, and imaging study. And for a case of a physiological causes, or when there's a dynamic obstruction, you got to do a rhinomanometry and a nasal peak inspiratory flow and computation fluid dynamics. And patient report outcome measures is the most important thing, where we are going to treat the patient. You are not going to treat the CT scan, or you are not going to treat the anatomical condition. So all these things are all drilled very well by our previous speaker. So the keystone area in the nasal septum is this this area, a 1 centimeter area on the anterior end and 1 centimeter area on the caudal end. This area gives you the projection of the nose, and this is called the L strut. So you have a nasal septum which has got a large area which gives you a functional unit, but it's not very useful. It's not a mandatory area to have this for a cosmetic appearance. And the L strut is the one area which is very important. So every time you have a deviated nasal septum, if you have in other areas, it will not produce big problems, or it can be easily sacrificed. So L strut is the area which is very important. So every time whenever there is a deviated nasal septum which doesn't produce any symptom, we need not do anything to the patient. You can leave them alone. Our idea is not to correct all the nasal septums. So a symptomatic nasal septal deviation got to be corrected. So the symptomatic deviation the symptom can be because of an anatomical deviation, or it can be because of any physiological or pathological conditions as well. You never have only one problem in a patient. Usually you have a multiple problems. So you will be having an anatomical problem as well as pathological problems also. So you got to treat both the problems, and you got to see how much is contributory is a structural problem or how much contributory is the pathological problem, and you got to correct whatever problem which is very important. Okay, so this is the basis of septal surgery, where you got to concentrate on this L strut. So whenever you do so when you examine the patient, you got to do a tip raising test. Tip raising test, you can't put a pudicum speculum directly inside the nose, because the flanges of a speculum will affect will hide the caudal deviation or any pathology on the front area of the nose. So first thing you do is called a tip raising test. Then you do an anterior rhinoscopy. Then you do what is called a caudal sign. Caudal sign is lifting the cheek will increase the airway, is a sign of nasal obstruction at the level of a nasal valve. Then you do a nasal endoscopy. You do airway patency test when you do it in the undergraduate. Now you do in the clinical exam also. These are all the small things which can be easily overlooked when you are presenting short case in your postgraduate examination. The nasal patency test is otherwise called a cold spatula test, or it's called a cotton whisk movement test. So the cold spatula test, negative or positive, need not be absolutely taken, because sometimes because of a nasal cycle, the obstruction, there may be an air fogging will be less on one side, and it can be because of the patency got to be checked pre-congestion and post-congestion. The nasal endoscopy is much better because we see the nasal cavity with a normal position, while when you do anterior rhinoscopy, you got to dilate the nose, so you might sometimes might not recognize the obstructive area. Then you should always palpate the nose, which we never do. You got to palpate for anterior nasal spine, whether it is jetting out one side or other. Whenever you suspect a fracture, you can palpate a fracture line, and you might need to palpate the area with the probe. Sometimes, like a Jobson RNA probe, gently, particularly when the patient is already operated in the nose and you don't know whether what surgery is done, it is always imperial to palpate the nasal septum with the Jobson RNA phone to see whether the cartilage is still there or whether thinned out cartilage is there. Then a decision making should be made whether the nasal obstruction is continuous or intermittent. Intermittent obstruction usually got to be associated with some mucosal problem or pathological problem, while the continuous obstruction is usually because of mass lesion or a deviated nasal septum, like structural cause. Then you should know what is called as Cotton's line. Cotton's line is an imaginary line joined from the spine of the frontal bone to the anterior nasal spine. A deviation which is anterior to the caudal line is called an anterior deviation, which is called posterior to the deviation is called a posterior deviation. When you do a septal surgery, we do two surgeries. One is called an SMR, submucosal resection. Other one is called a septoplasty. Submucosal resection is leaving that important L strut and removing the other part of the problematic septum. So this is the one where whenever there is a problem in the L strut itself, you can't remove the L strut also. So the anterior deviations are not ideal deviations to be managed by the radical surgery called submucosal resection, while more conservative septoplasty will give you a better results for an anterior deviation. To know which deviation is anterior, which deviation is posterior, you should know the Cottel's line. A diagnostic nasal endoscopy will give you an idea about what is the appearance of a nasal cavity. So this is the patient who has got a diagnostic nasal endoscopy done. This is called the first pass, which is mainly to see the inferior meatus, inferior turbinate, and then the nasal pharynx. So whenever there's a deviated, then you go above to look between the middle turbinate and the septum. Looking inside the middle turbinate and septum, we got to look for sphenoid area and the sphenoidal ostium and any pus or polyp in the sphenoethmoidal recess. Then the third pass, you can see the deviated septum. The third pass is between the most important part between the middle turbinate and the lateral nasal wall, which will give you idea about the osteomeatal complex. Hello. 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 Am I audible?
Yeah, carry on. Dr. Anthony, yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Audible, Anthony.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So whenever you make the examination, then you look for a medical management. So before you straight away go and operate the patient's septum, you should know whether the patient has got a predominantly medical condition or surgical condition. So to improve the nasal airway, you can use the following: intranasal steroids. You can use oral steroids. You can use an antihistamine. You can use an antihistamine. Along with that, you can do an exposure. You can use a decongestants. You can use a nasal washes with an hypertonic saline or a normal saline, and then intranasal antihistamines. All these things, the intranasal steroids and the oral steroids give you the best results, but the oral steroids have got a worst complications. So we always prefer an intranasal steroid. Antihistamines give you a reasonably good results. You can try a leukotriene inhibitors also. And then nasal decongestants, we got a gross rebound phenomenon, so it is not advisable to give a nasal decongestants. Nasal washes can be used, but that doesn't give you a very good result. So with all these things, we go for a surgery called submucosal resection of the nasal septum. So whenever there's a septal deviation, you take a scissor, put one limb above, one limb below, you can cut and take out the septum and throw it what is called a septectomy. Problem with septectomy is that when you remove the nasal septum completely, along with that you remove the mucosa, which is the functioning unit also. If you don't need a mucosa, you don't need a reason for having a nasal septum itself. So you can't remove the nasal septum. All you got to remove is the cartilage and the bony part of the septum, leaving behind the mucosa. The cartilaginous part of septum, how much you remove or how much you don't remove is what one is. You have the submucosal resection or septoplasty. Whenever there is a bony deviation or a posterior deviation, or whenever there is a deviation on the maxillary crest or a palatine crest, whatever happens, you got to remove that. So that will not come as a SMR or a septoplasty. Typically speaking, SMR or septoplasty is only for the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum. If you remove the bony part of the nasal septum, you got to do the same on every side. Okay, so the SMR can be done under local anesthesia or it can be done under general anesthesia. There are various incisions used for SMR. The commonest incision is the Killian's incision. mucoperichondrial flap. The mucoperichondrial flap on the anterior part is called an anterior tunnel. A mucoperichondrial flap on the inferior part is called an inferior tunnel. The anterior tunnel and inferior tunnel got to be connected so that you separate these two tunnels got to be separated as a single unit. Then you got to make an incision on a septal cartilage, and you got to elevate the same two tunnels on the opposite side. Once you remove these, according to whether you, in the case of a septoplasty, we elevate only 3 tunnels, that is 2 inferior tunnels and 1 anterior tunnel. Then you got to remove a part of a septal cartilage, leaving the L stud. Then you got to suture it, and you know about the complications. These are all the various settings you are going to do a very serious SMR. When you take an incision, you have 2 incisions. One is called a Killian's incision, which is about a 1 centimeter or 0.5 centimeter behind the mucocutaneous junction. And second one is called a Freers incision, which is made on the caudal end of the nasal septum or on the mucocutaneous junction itself. It's otherwise called an hemitransfixation incision. So what is the difference between the Killian's incision and the Freers incision? Why you put a Killian's incision is in the area where you make a Killian's incision, the mucoperichondrium is not very much adherent with that of the septum, so cartilage, so that you can easily elevate the flap like I have showed you. But in a case of a Freers incision, there are a lot of advantages. It is otherwise called hemitransfixation incision, which is done on the more anterior part, so you can visualize it better, particularly when you are doing a SMR with your headlight and your conventional instruments. Making incision is much easier for a Freers incision, and it is on the tougher plane, so that it will not tear easily. And it is an anterior incision, so that anytime if it tears, you can easily suture it and correct the tear. You can approach the anterior part of the nasal septum with a hemitransfixation incision. Anytime you got to convert a septoplasty into a septorhinoplasty, you can easily convert an hemitransfixation incision into a total transfixation incision, and you can proceed to do a septorhinoplasty in the same patient. But the problem is, it's a thicker one which is adherent with the septal cartilage, so elevation at that area will be very difficult, and you got to be a little cautious, and you got to wait for some time, and you got to do it little slowly. So, and if you take there are various types of hemitransfixation incision. If you are going to elevate only an anterior tunnel, you can stop short without coming up to the floor. So that is called a partial hemitransfixation incision. If you want to remove the projection on the floor, then you got to put a hockey stick like J-shaped incision, which is called a extended transfixation incision. Okay, so then this is the Killian's incision. You can see the mucocutaneous junction.
We cannot see that.
Which one, sir?
Dr. Anthony, yes, the video.
Are you not seeing the video?
No.
Sir, can you stop screen share and then again do a screen share and click here to share your screen, the first option?
Okay.
Yeah, now do screen share and select the first option. Click here to share a screen.
Yeah, for the hyperlinks, you'll have to go out and then do it. Otherwise, it won't play.
No, now you can click on the link and sir, just check. Now click on the link. Okay.
Yes.
Can you see now? Can you see now?
No, sir.
No, we cannot.
Sir, can you play the video manually from outside?
Yes, sir. From outside, if you play, it will play.
Okay, right. That I'll do. Can you see now?
No, we cannot.
Sir, you have to take away your PowerPoint and go to your video library.
And once you go there, then you play all the videos one
Can you
after
see
the other.
now?
No.
Stop sharing screen,
Yeah,
sir.
now it
Yeah,
is.
now we can see.
Yes.
Subcutaneous. When you do an endoscopic septoplasty or you do an endoscopic septal surgery, most difficult thing is to make an incision and doing the surgery on the anteriormost part because you will not get a hold of it. But once you go to the inside the nasal cavity, it is much easier to do. You see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint again, but videos, I think
PowerPoint.
you can show them all one after the other rather than coming back and forth.
Yeah, that's what I'll show the videos on the last part.
Yeah, you can do that. Yes.
Okay, so when you do once you make an incision, you elevate the mucoperichondrium. Actually, mucoperichondrium is continuous and to the opposite side, and the mucoperiosteum also is continuous to the opposite side. And then both the things are all adherent in between, so that it is easier to elevate a mucoperichondrial flap first, and then mucoperichondrial flap, and then connect both these two flaps. Or if you got to make an incision on the floor, and then you got to continue to elevate as a single flap. So once you elevate at the both sides, you got to make an incision on the nasal septum and go to the opposite side. On the opposite side, you again elevate a flap as an anterior tunnel and an elevated flap on the inferior tunnel. So once you have elevated on both sides, you see the septum in the middle, you made an incision leaving that L strut. So you got to remove the remaining part of the nasal septum. If there is a deviation on the bony part on the perpendicular plate or a vomer, you got to elevate at both sides and remove that bone also. Where if you see a spur on the floor of the nasal septum, you got to chisel it out and take out, or you can use a burr and take it out. So I'll show this video later. So once you have done that, you anchor the flap to a anterior nasal spine so that it stays there. What are all the commonest complications are all related to the injury? There may be tear. Tear occurs at one side of a flap is fine because it will not cause an accumulation of a blood in between. So a small tear on one side you need not bother. If you tear on both sides, you got to be doubly sure. So one such a the thing to do is you can keep the taken out cartilage can be kept at that place. Okay. So we see the surgery now. So after the incision, See, the anteriormost part, when you make an incision, a serious incision, it is little difficult to elevate the flap on the anterior part. So easier way to do that, you can use a sharp elevators. The sharp elevators will elevate it correctly. But once you get the plane, then elevation is much easier. Okay, so this is an anterior tunnel where you elevate between the mucoperichondrium and the septum. Okay. So you go to the bony cartilaginous junction. So when you come to the floor, you can see there's a thick fibrous layer. You can cut it, or you can elevate a separate flap lower down and connect both the flaps. So once you actually, when you are doing a septoplasty on the concave side, or always on the patient's left side, if you are a right-handed surgeon. So if you go up to the posterior most level on the bone, then you come lower down. That's a deviated path. So go beyond the deviated path and then slowly elevate the mucoperiosteial flap. That's a mucoperiosteial flap on the posterior aspect on the vomer bone, and then there is a special elevator called the Flemington elevator, which can be used for mucoperiosteial flap on the floor. So this is the flap on the floor. You can elevate as much laterally as possible on the floor of the nasal cavity. So every time, whenever there is a septal deviation like this, the mucosa will be very thin at that area. So you got to be really careful to elevate a flap. So once you are elevated, you got to elevate the flap on the opposite side. So you make an incision on the
The video has stopped, sir.
yeah, 1 minute. Is it coming now?
Yes.
Yes.
That's a plane. If you go on a right plane, the bleeding will be lesser. You can use a small J curette to retract the flap. It is much easier. particularly when you are doing with an endoscope. Then you dislocate the septum from the inferior aspect as well as posterior aspect, make the septal cartilage free. So once you make the septal cartilage free, you can see whether you need to do a SMR or a septoplasty. Then when you are doing an SMR, are you seeing my video? This is called as Ballinger's file knife. You take this knife, leave a 1 centimeter strut above. It cuts on all directions. You need not cut everything in a one go unless you are taking it for a graft purpose. Remove the cartilage. The endoscopic septoplasty or endoscopic septal correction can be done in various ways. Whenever you have only a horizontal cartilaginous deviation, you can make a horizontal incision, remove it. Whenever there is you use the gouge and you can nibble and take out, or you can even okay. So then it's a radical surgery where you are going to remove the whole of the septum except the very small part. Very small part. So you do what is called as another. It produces a lot of complications. So you do a surgery called as septoplasty. The concept of septoplasty is that there are two fixed areas. Whenever the cartilage is too big for the fixed area, it deviates to one side or other. So you cut this cartilage into small pieces, or you cut the vertical length of the cartilage, remove the inferior strut of a cartilage and cartilage, then it will come to the midline. See like this. So whenever you have a too big a cartilage for a too fixed area, then it will not stay in midline. So what you do is you free this area, you elevate flap on one side, elevate flap inferiorly, cut this part of the cartilage, elevate on opposite side also here. If needed, you remove this. Otherwise, you make a multiple incisions on this side, which is called scoring. If you score this area, then you can put a graft so that it will be stayed on midline. This is called a septoplasty. A septoplasty is a conservative surgery, while an SMR is a radical surgery. You make a Telian incision in the SMR and the Frias incision in the septoplasty. You elevate 4 flaps in SMR, you elevate 3 flaps in the septoplasty. You remove the whole of the cartilage, leaving behind the anterior strut and the caudal strut. or dorsal stud and the caudal stud, or the L stud. In a case of a septoplasty, you remove only the inferior stud. You don't make scoring in the SMR while you make scoring in the septoplasty. And then the complications are all high in the SMR. The complications are low in septoplasty. And you cannot do a surgery for an anterior deviation, or you cannot do a surgery for a caudal dislocation. In a case of a submucosal resection, you can do a surgery in these cases also in a case of a septoplasty. When all these are all advantages for the septoplasty, why still we are doing an SMR? Because the results are all better with that of the submucosal resection than with that of the septoplasty. Okay, so there are various techniques of septoplasty is there, which is called a cutting technique. What I have showed you, you remove the excess of the cartilage and then remove the excess of the cartilage and then you make the scoring. There's something called a grafting technique, or it can be suturing technique, or relocation technique. Relocation is that you separate the cartilage from all the bony attachment and relocate it and try to keep it in midline. Stitching is that stitch the cartilage, you trim the cartilage and stitch the cartilage to the anterior nasal spine. And then this is called as a grafting technique, where you remove the cartilage and make a splitting of the L stud, and then you fix it with the bone graft. Then endoscopic septal correction is different in the sense that endoscopic septal correction, you can do an endoscopy with an SMR, or you can do an endoscopy with a septoplasty, or you can push the spur to an opposite side. You just break it, or sometimes you will do you can remove only the deviated part alone. Particularly the deviated part is on the posterior side. You can make an incision on the deviated part, remove that part, and replace the flap. So this is the advantages of endoscopic septoplasty. There is something called an external approach, where you do an extracorporeal septal correction, which is a part of a septorhinoplasty. Then pediatric septoplasty, we don't do a radical surgeries in the cases of a pediatric septoplasty, because that's only a broomstick like a fracture. You can use whenever very small babies, you can bring it into midline by keeping the nasal clips, or you can push it to the other side, and then you can do a very gross deviations. You can still do a septoplasty. I think with this, the deviated nasal septum is being taken care of. I hope it will be useful for the juniors and the first year and second year MS postgraduates. Thank you very much. I once again thank the AOI body for giving me an opportunity to take a class for the postgraduates in this certificate course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. In fact, there are a few questions for you. And there is a question. Hello? Hello, sir?
Yeah.
Hello? Hello, Dr. Thomas? Hello? Hello, Dr. Thomas? Hello?
Sir, I'm hearing.
Okay. There is a question from Dr. Prakash. There is a question from Dr. Prakash Gupta. He says that the X-ray PNS, though rejected by many to a CT, still has a place for diagnosis. In the DNS and blockage and type of it is one of the cheapest investigations possible. So what do you think? For a patient, when he comes to you, would you advise him a CT PNS straight away, or would you go for an X-ray PNS also?
That depends. In the patient who has got a grossly deviated nasal septum, I am pretty sure I am going to do only a septal correction. An X-ray PNS is fine. But X-ray PNS is only a screening investigation. It's not a diagnostic investigation. You can screen for that. But if you have a mucosal problem or pathology as well as a structural problem, you want to make a decision to see whether you are going to operate only septum, or you want to do other surgeries, like you want to do a middle metal antrostomy, or you want to do a thing. If that is the case, you got to do a CTPNS. Otherwise, if you have an isolated septal deviation, you can still go ahead and do the X-ray PNS. That is fine.
Okay. Now there is a question from Dr. Vinod Garg from Moga as well as Dr. Rajesh Jain. The thing is, how will you treat the anti-ethmoidal nerve syndrome?
Anterior ethmoidal nerve syndrome, you do a septal correction, that will become better. Because the anterior ethmoidal nerve syndrome comes because the patient, there's a contact zone between the high deviated septum and the anterior ethmoidal nerve. So when you correct the deviated part alone, the patient will become better. How will you diagnose that? That when you
Yes.
keep a 4% xylocaine on that area, when the pain disappears, that's an ideal case where you can do, and then the patient will feel better.
Right. So there are, question asked by many people, and I'll not name them, but basically the question is how to treat caudal dislocation of septum.
Yeah, caudal dislocation of the septum, you got to create a columnar pocket. So whenever that is the reason you make an incision on an anterior end of the septum. Sometimes the anterior end will be far lateral to the other side. If that is the case, you can do a front to back. You make a columnar pocket and bring the septum inside that. The excess part of the septum, which is the excess part of the septum which is anterior to the L strut, which can be trimmed off, and then the excess trimmed off, and then the pliable part of the anterior dislocation got to be cut, and then the remaining part got to kept inside the columnar pocket and got to be stitched to the anterior nasal spine.
Yes. So once you are told about the L strut, people have asked, Dr. Rajesh Jain from Bilwara has again asked, what is the size of the L strut?
1 centimeter, close to 1 centimeter. Vertically.
Sir, I have one last. Yeah. 1 centimeter you mean to say, yeah?
That's what textbook says.
Okay.
But it comes with our experience. Some people see cut. It doesn't matter unless there is a deviation. Leave little bit more, nothing will happen.
That will happen. That's true. And sir, there are so many questions pouring in for me, but naturally there is a time constraint. But there is one more last question which I'm taking up is, what is the minimum age of pediatric septoplasty, sir?
Minimum, see, pediatric septoplasty, you don't advise septoplasty before the age of 12 years unless it is grossly problematic. You do surgery unless it is an infant. Infant, you can try to dislocate it to bring it to that midline with your nasal clips. After that, if there is a very grossly deviated septoplasty, deviated septum, and there is no other problem, still you can do it, but do your work as minimal as possible. So we
Sir,
not advisable before 12 years.
Before 12 years,
Unless
okay.
you
Sir,
are-
Sir, people have appreciated your presentation very well, and people are very happy with your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us today in this AOI certificate course. I am very thankful to Dr. Samir Bhargav, Dr. Bharti ma'am, Dr. Kaushal, Dr. Yogesh Dabholkar, and the entire AOI governing body for making me and Dr. Sudhakar Vaidya as the moderators of this association, of this session, sorry. And thank you all very much. And of course, we wish that this certificate series keeps on going and is very educative. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Kaushal. And thank you all very much. Let's sign off for tonight. And thank you very much, Professor, sir.
Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Good night. Good night, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanti. Yes, yes,
Thank
yes.
you very much. Thank you all of you.
Kanti, thank you very much. Kanti, so nice of you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. This was a really very nice presentation.